All right, good morning, everybody. Starting a couple minutes late here, but it's hard to fast forward or skip over Jesus Loves Me, right? That's such a good song. It's such a good thing to be reminded of on a daily basis, and just as a reminder for Christians out there and Christians trying to fight the good fight of faith, and being a good soldier of Jesus Christ, all those things are important, but never forget that it was the love of God is the reason that you're even a Christian today. And never downplay the importance of love in the Christian life. I think sometimes there, as I've made reference in previous lessons, there's this pendulum overreaction sometimes, and sometimes there's so much effeminacy a lot of times in contemporary Christianity. And so along with that, you're going to have a lot of love and stuff, but love is not bad, and love and focus on love is not bad. But I think sometimes Bible believers can perceive the effeminacy in Christianity and associate that with love, and so they can knee-jerk and go the other direction to where there's not a lot of love, and or love is perceived as some kind of sissy thing or some kind of thing for weak Christians, or something that's not very important. But that is not the message of the Bible. In fact, it's the exact opposite. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out because I think that's important, especially for Bible-believing men, to remember that love is not a sissy thing. Love is the theme of the Bible, essentially, and thank God for it. And so anyway, let's go ahead and get started with the lesson today. I've got a lot of notes here for you, a lot of things to cover, and if you're a person who likes to think, a person who likes to ponder and get into some deep stuff with thinking and Bible study, I think you'll enjoy these lessons on the subject of human rights. And as I mentioned last week, this is not just a relevant societal subject, the subject of human rights, but it's actually a biblical subject. It's a theological subject with theological implications. And so it's important as Christians that we study this subject. This is not a waste of time. And for example, the doctrine of Calvinism really it teaches the idea of total depravity of man and the sovereign election of God for salvation, meaning man cannot choose salvation. God chooses salvation for him, and God decides who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. And both of those ideas require the ideas of total depravity and the ideas of the sovereign election of God for salvation. Those things require that man have no rights, no free will. No rights to choose. And if God has predetermined who goes to heaven and who goes to hell, which is what Calvinism teaches, then the concept of rights is a joke, and truly the idea you have no rights is a valid concept, at least in Calvinism. Now it's not in biblical in the Bible, in Bible Christianity, but for some reason that logic seems to prevail in some Bible-believing circles that you have no rights. And as many as you are aware, Calvinism teaches false doctrine. And God's sapient creation does have free will. And if you believe that, if you believe that Calvinism is wrong, and if you believe that man has free will, then do you realize what you're saying? By saying that man has a free will, you are insinuating that God has given certain rights to his creation. So for you to say that you have no rights, but then profess that you believe in free will, well, you're contradicting yourself. All right, so the teaching in some Bible-believing circles of you have no rights is simply not true. All right, and this study is going to go pretty deep, and toward the end of these lessons especially. But for now, I'm going to just do a quick recap of what we hit last week. And real quick, last week I used the term centurnal beings. I invented a word to describe man, angels, and cherubim as opposed to plants and animals and the consciousness of them. And I had to invent a word, centurnal, sentient and eternal, centurnal. But a listener, Brandon, commented in the comments last week and mentioned that sapient would be a good word. So I decided to go with sapient because it's an actual word, and it does kind of describe what I'm getting at. So when I said universal sapient beings' rights, this doesn't include animal rights or plant rights, and all that stuff. This has to do with angels, cherubim, and man, the sapient beings in the universe that will exist somewhere forever. All right. So these beings, God has afforded the right to life, meaning that those beings cannot, no angel, cherub, or human is allowed to murder another angel, cherub, or human without their consent. And consent, by consent, I mean direct consent or indirect consent through deception. All right, and then there's a right to liberty. No angel, cherubim, or man is allowed to enslave another angel, cherubim, or man without their direct or indirect consent. And then there's a right to choice, or the right to free will. And we went over that for the last couple weeks. But what I'm interested primarily in these lessons is the subject of human rights. I'm not so much worried about cherubim and angels. All right, we're talking about human rights. What are the universal human rights? And as I explained last week, there are three subjects to this discussion that are inseparable when it comes to this subject of human rights. And this is what we have is essentially the Trinity of Justice, if you will. And the Trinity of Justice is human rights, or rights, laws, and government. You can't talk about one of those things without talking about the other two. It's just impossible because all three go together. The existence of rights, let's see. The existence of rights necessitates laws. The existence of rights necessitates laws to protect those rights. And the existence of laws necessitates government to uphold those laws, to defend those rights. You see how that works, all right? And the reverse is also true. The existence of government, which we know obviously exists and is ordained of God, we know that from Romans, the existence of government implies the existence of laws. Otherwise, what's the point in having a government, right? The fact that there's a government logically implies that there are laws, and we know that there are laws, okay? So the fact that there's government implies there are laws, otherwise there'd be no point for government. And the existence of laws, which we know exist, 10 Commandments as we're getting into, the existence of laws implies the existence of rights. Otherwise, what would be the point of having laws, okay? So this is important because, again, this teaching, you have no rights, is not true. It can't be true. The fact that there are laws in the universe given by God implies that there are rights, okay? So you're going to have to get that idea out of your head, the idea that you have no rights, because that's just not true, and it's not biblical, as I'm explaining. And in order to have justice in this world, you have to have those three components. Now, interestingly enough, think about this. What would happen if you eliminated one of those components? Well, the fact is, if you eliminated one of those components, you would not have justice anymore. If you had government and laws, but no rights, okay? If you had governments and laws, but you had no rights, you know what you would have? You would have tyranny. Government and laws, but no rights. The government would do whatever it wants, and it would invent laws to justify whatever it wanted to do. And humanity is crushed under these conditions where there's government and laws, but no rights. And there are countries in the world like that. And those are tyrannical governments. And humanity is crushed under those conditions, and wickedness always prevails in that type of society. North Korea would be a good example of that. The North Koreans don't have any rights, but they do have a government and they do have laws. And they have a tyrannical dictatorship. All right? If you have human rights and laws, let's say you have human rights and laws but no government, what you get in that scenario is anarchy. Wish I had a better green marker here. But you get anarchy. If you have human rights and laws, but no government, you have anarchy. Basically, you can talk about human rights in that society and collectively decide on whatever laws the people want. But if there's no one to enforce the laws and no one to punish the disobedience of the laws, then eventually evil people will take advantage of the situation and the whole thing will descend into anarchy. And once again, in this scenario where you have rights and laws but no government to enforce the laws, wickedness prevails in that society. And that scenario, the idea of human rights and laws but no government, is essentially what those who want to defund the police are calling for. Those who want to defund the police, they want their rights, and they understand that there needs to be laws to protect those rights. but they don't want government. They don't want an arm. They don't want a sword to enforce the laws. So they want to defund the police. Well, that's not going to work. As a matter of fact, Portland, Oregon did a massive reduction in their police force last year. And guess what? Well, violence in Portland skyrocketed over 800% in 1 year. And a year ago, the city leaders were talking about how evil the police were. And now that their city is destroyed and no one wants to visit there anymore, and people are fleeing there in droves, and all the money is going out of the city, guess what the city leaders are now doing? Well, they're offering incentives for the retired police officers to come back and join the force. You know, they defunded the police, their city went to pot, and now they want to hire the police back on. What a bunch of hypocrites, right? Well, that's what you get when you have no government, but you want to have rights and laws. You get anarchy. All right. Now think about this. What if you have? Let's see. What's the other one here? If you have government and rights, but no laws. Government and rights, but no laws. And I guess the word that I would use here, I'm just gonna. This was kind of a tough one to figure out because you don't really see this in societies. But I would say apathy, maybe irresponsibility, maybe that'd be a better word. But the situation, like I said, to have government and rights but no laws, it doesn't make sense for a society, but you do see it in households a lot of times. And basically what you'd have is the parents are essentially the government of the home, and the children have all kinds of rights given to them by the parents, but there are no laws and there are no rules, and consequently there's no discipline in the home. And the parents are apathetic towards the kids and let the kids do whatever they want, and the kids are apathetic toward the parents and don't listen to anything the parents have to say. And you essentially, in a household like that, you have government and you have rights, but you have no laws, no rules, and so consequently no one cares about the direction or destination of anything, and everyone is irresponsible. There's no accountability whatsoever, and under these conditions, again, guess what? Wickedness will prevail in the end. All right, so there's no justice under tyranny, and when a crime is committed against you, you can't appeal to the authorities because the authorities don't believe that you have any rights, and they don't feel obligated to help you. And there's no justice under a societal condition of anarchy, right? Because when a crime is committed against you, you can't appeal to the authorities because there are no authorities to appeal to. And then there's no justice under apathy, because when a crime is committed against you, you can appeal to the authorities, but nothing will happen because no one cares, right? So the Trinity of Justice that is required for justice to take place is there has to be laws, there has to be government to enforce the laws, and there has to be rights. Human rights are a thing, Bible believer. There has to be rights in order for there to be justice. All three are interconnected, and God has ordained government to uphold the laws and uphold God's laws, and God's laws are instituted to protect the people that God created and their rights. God has desired that humans be able to enjoy the life that God gave to them and the world that God put them in. But for this to happen, humans must have rights which are validated by laws and which are to be upheld by government. Okay? So what we know according to the Bible is there is such a thing as human rights, but now we need to figure out what those rights are according to the Bible. When we try to figure out what are the human rights, we don't go to the Bill of Rights, the United States Bill of Rights, to find out what human rights are. Nor do we go to the United Nations Universal Bill of Human Rights to find out what human rights are. If we want to know what the human rights are, we got to go to the Bible. And as you'll remember, in order to know what the universal human rights are that apply to all people across the world, every race, tribe and tongue, and past, present, and future. In order to know what the universal human rights are, we first have to know what the universal human laws are, because those laws are going to be a reflection of those rights. All right? So we know that God has written His law on the hearts of all men, okay? And every man's conscience bears witness to God's laws. And we saw that in Romans chapter 2. The question is, which laws are written on the heart of men? I don't know if you've ever thought about this question. We know that we have the 10 Commandments, but are all 10 Commandments written on the heart of men? If they are, then the heart of all men everywhere at all times, before the law, during the law, after the law, should bear witness to all 10 of those commandments. But we know that that's not the case. All right, so the Jews were given 10 commandments, but as we saw last week, not all 10 commandments are directly for all men, for Jews and Gentiles. So we want to know which laws are universal laws for everybody, Jew and Gentile combined. And whichever of the 10 commandments that are written on the heart of man, okay, so when we're trying to find out the universal human rights and the universal human laws, what we're looking for is laws of the 10 commandments that are going to be recognized by all men's conscience, okay, regardless of culture, okay, laws that are recognized by all men's conscience. These are going to be the laws that are written on the heart of mankind. They're recognized by all men's conscience, and those laws are going to be required to be upheld by governments. All governments, not just Israeli Jewish government, but all governments of the world. Whatever the laws written on the heart, they're going to be recognized by conscience, and human nature is such that the governments are going to be required by God to uphold those laws. God expects that of those governments. So real quickly, commandments 1 through 4, you remember, pertain to God. No other gods, no idols, not take God's name in vain, keep the Sabbath. Those pertain to God. And commandments 5 through 10 we were getting into, we didn't finish, but it looks like these ones pertain to man. Honor your parents, no killing, no adultery, no stealing, and so on. All right? Question. Are commandments 1 through 4 written on the heart of all men? And we went into that last week, and I would say the answer is no. And the reason why these commandments obviously these are sins, and people shouldn't have idols. But you remember that according to Acts 17, God winked at the idolatrous heathen with their idols. Their conscience didn't have a problem with idols. As a matter of fact, the heathen Gentiles think they're doing the right thing by representing the God of the universe with an image, right? So their conscience didn't bear witness against that. The fact of the matter is, humans have always had a vague they've always had a vague understanding that there is a all-powerful God who is out there, but in order for mankind to know God, God has to give a revelation of himself to man. And God did not do that for all mankind. He has revealed himself through nature, and there are some general things about God and about his power and things like that men can know. But they don't know much about his character, and that has to be revealed, and God revealed himself and his character to the Jewish people. He gave the full revelation of himself to the Jews. So the Gentiles couldn't really revere the one true God or abstain from taking his name in vain, because frankly they didn't even know what his name was. All right? So commandments 1 through 4, as we went through last week, I'm not going to go through all of it again, but commandments 1 through 4, these things are not written on the heart of all men. I gotta open this up a little bit. These commandments are not written on the heart of all men, and they are furthermore not required to be upheld by all human governments. Okay, so we're going to scratch those off when we're seeking for the universal human laws, trying to find out what the universal human rights are. All right, so commandment number 5 was debatable. That's honor thy father and thy mother. Is that written on the heart of all men? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But we concluded that even if this was written on the heart, governments are not obligated by God to enforce that law. Honor thy father and thy mother. Even the Jewish government was not obligated to get involved in the home and ensure that children are honoring their parents. The only time the government was to get involved was in extreme circumstances where exasperated parents would bring their rebellious child to the government, and then the government could step in. Other than that, honor thy father and thy mother, even if it is written on the heart and in the conscience of mankind, which you could argue maybe it is, maybe it isn't, it was not a commandment to be upheld by the government. So as far as a universal law reflecting a universal right, that one wouldn't count either. All right, and that commandment has to do with parental authority, not governmental authority. And commandment number 6, we got into these ones. Now this is where you're going to start getting into the universal human laws that apply to all men everywhere and every man's conscience knows about. And it's no killing. All right, thou shalt not kill. All right. That's a universal law written on the hearts of all men. All men know that murder is wrong, and no Bible is necessary for any man anywhere at any time to know that murder is wrong. All right? And this, by the way, is another proof that evolution is a lie. If we're all just evolved animals, then where do these universally recognized moral concepts come from? if we're all just evolved animals? And the only explanation to that is that God has written these things on the heart of mankind, right? And the law, thou shalt not kill, hearkens to the right to life. The right to your life. Thou shalt not kill. That's the law to protect the right to your life. All right? No man is simply permitted to kill another man. And we looked at that a little bit more in detail last week. The seventh commandment, like I said, this is all just review, is thou shalt not commit adultery. All right? And all nations, no matter if they're Jew or Gentile, before the law or after the law, everybody knows that it's a sin, it's wrong to take somebody else's wife. All governments, people know that. And so this is something that's written on the conscience of all men, and also governments uphold these laws. All governments have known that you punish the murderer, okay? All governments know that you punish the adulterer, or at least they're supposed to. It's written on the heart of mankind. And you even see that back in the Old Testament in the Bible. Now, I'll explain a little bit more about that government stuff here in a minute. But essentially, this commandment of thou shalt not commit adultery harkens to the idea of the right to, basically the right to your wife. That is a human right. Now, that wasn't outlined on the Bill of Rights, but it should have been. Okay? Can you imagine if that was outlined in the Bill of Rights, how much less problems we would have in our society? It's amazing. But they didn't outline that one, and they should have. But no man is permitted to have an affair with another man's wife. And so again, the teaching that you have no rights, that's not true. We've already seen you got 2 rights right there. And if you did not, let's say you didn't have any rights. Let's say that was true. You have no rights. If you didn't have a right to your wife, then any guy could come along, take her for himself, and you would have no legitimate legal recourse in that situation. It would just be, well, tough luck for you, buddy. The reason why you can appeal to the authorities, and the authorities are supposed to punish the adulterer, is because you have a right to her and no one is to infringe upon your right. Okay? Now keep in mind that these are universal human laws, and these are human versus human crimes that we're looking at right here. In the case of adultery, the wife committed the crime against her husband, and the other guy committed the crime against the husband, and in that situation, the husband is the victim. All right? And God recognizes the husband's right to seek legal and lawful vengeance in that situation. And the government is to honor the man's right to his wife and execute punishment accordingly. Now, government is responsible to obey God by upholding God's laws. Okay? These 2 things are written on the heart of men, and consequently, governments are supposed to uphold these things. These are God's laws, and God expects all governments to uphold those things, not just Jewish government. Okay? And interestingly enough, though, when it comes to governments and the enforcement of God's universal laws, the commandment about thou shalt not commit adultery seems to be the commandment where the breakdown within government always begins. I mean, government is composed of individuals, and those individuals are sinners. So there's never going to be a perfect government because it's composed of imperfect people. But when it comes to the breakdown of government and what it's supposed to be, it's interesting that almost always at the heart of that thing, perhaps without exception, I don't know, I'd have to think about it, but you look at most cases and adultery is right there in the middle of that thing for some reason. And I'll say a few more things about that toward the end of this lesson. All right, so you have a right to your wife, and you have a right to your life and a right to your wife. Okay, commandment number 8, thou shalt not steal. Now these are all from Exodus chapter 20, verse 15, thou shalt not steal. This is another one of our universal laws that are written on the hearts of all men. No one needs a Bible to know that stealing is wrong. Before the 10 Commandments were ever written, people knew that stealing was wrong, and everyone's conscience already bears witness to that. And that is a universal law which is to be enforced universally by government. And so here we find another universal human right. Because stealing is on the conscience, and stealing is to be upheld by governments. Government's supposed to punish those who steal. And so therefore, because we got the universal law to be upheld universally by governments, we find that we have a universal right. Okay? What is that right? The law that says thou shalt not steal harkens to the right of the right to your possessions, or personal property, if you want to call it that. The right to your possessions. The things that I own, I either earned or inherited, and they belong to me and to my household. And no one else is allowed to take those things from me. And if they do, there is supposed to be a punishment executed upon them for doing so. And God recognizes that, right? Again, these are rights that pertain to humans and among humans. These are human versus human crimes. When it comes to the right to my possessions, okay, this is not a right that I have before God. Okay, remember the vertical, horizontal, inverted? These are horizontal human rights. This is not vertical rights per se. Vertically, God can, as far as my human life goes, God can take my life, right? He gave me my breath. If I die, and he has me die at a young age, God hasn't sinned or transgressed against me or defrauded me of my right. He gave me my life. There's a right to my wife, or I don't have a right to my wife. Now, let me just say that when it comes to here, there is a right to life, but we'll get into that later. The right to my wife. I don't have a right. God can take my wife if he wanted to. He told that to Ezekiel. He says, hey, your wife is going to die. Ezekiel didn't say, that's my wife. You can't take my wife. The Bible says that, no, God can. These things are horizontal rights. And when it comes to my possessions, God can take my possessions too. Why? Because all the things that I have, a prudent wife is from who? The Lord, right? God gives me these things within the context of this world. And so the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. The Lord can do that. These are rights that I have among humans, but human versus human, horizontal. But when it comes to human and God, this is a different story. All right? When it comes to possessions, I have no right to my possessions because truthfully, everything I have was his before I got it. Psalms 24 verse 1 says, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Everything in this world belongs to God ultimately. Even the wealth that you have earned is given to you by God, because Deuteronomy 8:18 says, it is the Lord that giveth thee power to get wealth. You say, yeah, but I work a job and I earned this money. This was what I did. No, God gave you the health to be able to work your job to get your wealth. So you should thank him for it. All material objects you own were made from elements that God created. The wood in your house is made from God's trees. The fabric of your clothing is made from the wool or the skin from God's animals. The food on your table came from God's vegetables. The synthetic products that you own came from God's chemicals and God's elements. And the precious metals that your currency is supposedly supposed to be based upon were created by God and dug out of his earth. Right? Since everything belongs to God, truthfully, he is simply allowing us to borrow his stuff. All right? 1 Timothy 6:17 says, God giveth us richly all things to enjoy. But God gave it. Every possession I have came from God, and if he, for whatever reason, decided to take away my possessions, he would have every right to do so. Okay? God would have the right, not me. Okay, and Job, like I said, Job recognized that when he said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return hither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Okay, obviously no one wants to lose everything. Nobody wants that, but if you did, let's say through natural disaster or something completely outside of your control, legally, God has not defrauded you. Okay. And the best thing to do in that situation, if that ever happened to you, is to bless God like Job did. Because truthfully, even though God has taken away, God can always give again after he has taken away. You see, God gave you what you had in the first place. He took away the things he gave you. That doesn't mean your life is over. God can always give you those things back. And believe me, he'd be more inclined to give those things back to you if you praised him and had a good attitude about it, as opposed to cursing God for your losses. You have no right to curse God, and you are not justified ever in your cursing of God. It's just, you don't have a right to that. So don't be hasty and foolish to curse God and your losses. In the context of man versus God, you do not have a right to your possessions. But in the context of man versus man, you most certainly do have a right to your possessions. And if someone steals from you, you are perfectly within your right to appeal to the authorities because it is their God-given duty to uphold that law and to defend your right. Okay? That's how it's supposed to work. So we have the right to your life, your physical life, your earthly life, okay? The right to your wife, the right to your possessions, and then we have commandment number 9, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Okay? So this one, we're going through the laws, trying to find out what are the universal human laws for all men. All right? In preaching, we usually apply this commandment to telling lies in general. You're not supposed to bear false witness, not supposed to tell something that's not true. Which, of course, telling lies is wrong and it is sinful. But this commandment, specifically about bearing false witness against your neighbor, is specifically referring to a courtroom scenario where a person has come before a judge, the government, the governor, and has made a false accusation against another person. He is bearing false witness before a judge. Okay, that's the context of what we're dealing with here, and I'll show you that in a second. And perhaps, this guy hated this other guy, and he wanted what he had, right? But the wicked person knew that he couldn't kill the guy and take it, or he couldn't just steal from that person without getting into trouble himself. And let's see. I think I messed up something here. Where did my notes go? I did. Oh, I missed a note. Hold on just a second. Just a second. Okay. I could just wing it, but there's an important thing I want to get to with this, so I don't want to just wing this. Here we go. All right. So essentially, the guy maybe wanted to kill the person or steal what he had, but he didn't want to do that because he was afraid of getting in trouble from the local authorities. And so instead, what he does is he invents a false charge against that person and essentially uses the government to steal, injure, or kill that person. And that's exactly what happened with Naboth and Ahab and Jezebel when they wanted to steal the vineyard. They used the judicial system to steal that vineyard and get Naboth killed. And basically that's an extremely dangerous and extremely wicked situation when people are using the judicial system as a weapon against other people. And basically, God has specified a commandment here in commandment number 9 about not bearing false witness. He specified a commandment against using the judicial system to commit criminal activity. Here we go. This is what I wanted. Deuteronomy chapter 19. Deuteronomy chapter 19. Now I'm a little off track here, but that's okay. Deuteronomy chapter 19. I thought I printed out. I must have missed a page. It might be on my printer. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. So this is going to elaborate on the commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness. Deuteronomy 19:15. It says, one witness shall not rise up against another man for any iniquity or for any sin in any sin that he sinneth. At the mouth of 2 witnesses or at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall the matter be established. All right, so the context is a lawsuit in a courtroom setting type of thing. Verse 16, if a false witness, okay, scripture is scripture, false witness. This is what we're dealing with. It's not just lying in general, okay? It's a human versus human crime that we're dealing with these commandments here, specifically these 4 commandments. And we have a false witness who's risen up against a man, in court, in a legal proceeding, before a judge or before a king, okay? He's risen up against a man, and to testify against him that which is wrong. Then both the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges, which shall be in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition, and they're supposed to do that by asking questions, examining evidence, and so on and so forth. And behold, if the witness be a false witness, broke the law, and hath testified falsely against his brother in court, then shall ye do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. So shalt thou put away the evil from among you. And those which remain shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more any such evil among you. And thine eye shall not pity, but life shall go for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. All right? So it says you're supposed to do unto that false witness as he had planned to do unto his brother. In other words, there was a reason why he brought those false charges against his brother. He had a reason for doing so. He was trying to use the legal system to steal, injure, or kill his brother. And this is called basically lawfare in our modern society today. And the word is related to warfare, but lawfare basically means the use of law as a weapon against your enemy. Okay, that's lawfare, or the strategy of using or misusing the law as a means to achieve a personal objective against someone else. Okay, that's what bearing false witness has to do with. Frivolous lawsuits are a form of bearing false witness. SLAPP, S-L-A-P-P lawsuits are a form of bearing false witness. SLAPP lawsuits basically stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation, and is essentially a claim filed against a person or organization for exercising their free speech. So what happens is SLAPP lawsuits are used to scare or intimidate truth tellers into being silent, because they use these lawsuits to drain their target's financial resources and basically get them to shut up. Basically, it's just using the law to drain somebody of all their money, because the legal system and defending yourself in court is extremely expensive. And so a person that basically gets sued for wrong reasons, they didn't do anything wrong, but basically they're just sued into oblivion. And basically they get them to be quiet. They get them to be silent through this misuse of the law. That's bearing false witness. And God's solution to this potential abuse of the legal system was to reward the innocent victim with the very thing that the lying person, like the ACLU, is trying to obtain, or the Southern Poverty Law Center. You know, they're always filing frivolous lawsuits to sue people for millions of dollars, just basically for speaking truth. And they try to destroy people and their lives and their organizations and put them out of business through these frivolous lawsuits. The ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center is daily engaged in bearing false witness. All right? So basically, he says, those that remain, if you were to follow this law like the Bible says, God expects governments to enforce punishments against those who try to bear false witness in court, and governments are supposed to punish those who try to use the legal system unlawfully. He says, basically, those which remain, if you'll punish them, shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more any such evil. All right, and there's supposed to be no pity upon the man that tries to misuse the legal system for his own benefit. All right, the government's proper execution of judgment is the only way to suppress wickedness in a society. Wickedness will always be lurking and will always be looking for an opportunity to rise up. Even in the millennium, that's going to be happening. But when the wicked fear punishment, it will always be a deterrent to crime. Ecclesiastes 8:11 says, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. All right, so thou shalt not bear false witness, specifically lying before a judge to get someone else in trouble, I believe can be added to our list of universal human laws. In all cultures, everywhere, individual conscience bears witness to the fact that you're not supposed to lie against someone else in court to get them in trouble. Everybody knows that, and God expects all governments to uphold that law. And since that's a universal human law that's supposed to be upheld universally by governments everywhere, it means that we found another one of our universal human rights, and the universal human right is the right to a fair trial. The right to a fair trial. Because remember, all of these universal laws that are written on the heart of men hearken to a universal right. They're reflections of a right. Okay, so the idea of not bearing false witness in court means that everybody is entitled to a fair trial. Think about it. If someone lies about you before a judge, bears false witness, that person obviously should not be doing that in the first place, but if they do, you should have a right to be able to bear true witness in your defense. But in order for your true witness to be able to counter their false witness, it would require a fair trial, right? Some false witness can't just go up and lie about you and then the government come and put you in jail. You have to be able to plead your case, right? And that requires a fair trial. Everyone has the right to a fair trial, not simply to a trial, right? Because a trial is a pointless formality if it's not a fair trial. But in order to have a fair trial, you have to have a judge who is impartial. Both sides of the argument have to be heard before any sentence can be given. And punishment for a crime is not to be inflicted until guilt is proven. Or as we have in our society, the saying, innocent until proven guilty. So all throughout the Bible, God insists upon the importance of a fair trial, or in Bible terms, just judgment. Judgment that is just. Justice. Hebrews 12:23 says that God is the judge of all, and God himself affords a fair trial to all, because you cannot have just judgment and justice without a fair trial, and God is a just judge. So you can be sure that there is going to be a fair trial. And I'll get a little bit ahead of myself here, but there's actually 4 rights to the sentient beings, and the other one is right to a fair trial. Now what's interesting about this, and I'll get more into it next week, is you have 4 universal human rights, and you have 4 sapient being rights that apply to angels and cherubim and man. Angels and cherubim even have a right to a fair trial, and they're going to get that at the judgment seat, the great white throne judgment. And I'll get more into that later. Everyone has a right to a fair trial, because if there wasn't a fair trial, then God would not be a just judge. So anyway, well, like I said, that's getting into some deep stuff, but we'll get into that later. God is a just judge, and therefore he requires that all rulers and all governments, human governments, be just judges too. 2 Samuel 23:2 says, "The Spirit of the Lord spake by me, and his word was in my tongue. The God of Israel said, the God of Israel spake to me, the rock of Israel spake to me. This is what God told David. He that ruleth over men must be just, ruling in the fear of God." Now that was already on David's heart. I mean, he didn't need God necessarily to tell him that. It wasn't like a big revelation. Oh, I'm supposed to be just and rule within the fear of God and obedience to God. Those things were already written on the heart of men. But it's just restated there clearly that God requires all human governments and all human rulers and all kings to be just. He requires that because he's the God of all men. And he's that way, so he requires that for all mankind. All right? So that's not just a law for the Jews or for the Israeli government. That's for all mankind, and all mankind knows that. And in fact, that's what God accused the angelic rulers before the flood of messing up in Psalms 82. They were judging unjustly, and God condemned them for it. And that was long before the 10 Commandments were ever written. So we can safely say that our 4 inalienable, universal human rights are the right to your life, the right to your wife, the right to your possessions, and the right to a fair trial. And the 4th one is the linchpin, really, of the other 3, because if someone does kill someone in your family, if someone does commit adultery with your wife, if someone does steal your possessions, your recourse is the judicial system. And if you didn't have the right to a fair trial, then you would have no power whatsoever to appeal to anyone for your grievances. So this one is really the foundation to the other 3. If you don't have the 4th, you're not going to have the other 3. And if you take time to, oh, by the way, let me say this. The founding fathers of America understood that. They understood the importance of a fair trial and how a fair trial in the judicial system upholds everything else. And 4 out of the 10 articles of the Bill of Rights have to do with proper conduct in court cases. 4 out of 10 of the Bill of Rights have to do with a fair trial, a just judicial system. And if you really take the time to think about all this logically, you'll arrive at the same conclusion. Fairness and righteousness within the judicial system is paramount to all other rights, because all of your rights are upheld by the judicial system, and if the judicial system is corrupt, you will be defrauded out of your rights. The right to a fair trial is the foundation of the other three rights, and I'll say more about that in another lesson. Commandment number 10, really quick, thou shalt not covet. Now, that's an interesting commandment in the context of what we're talking about. Does covetousness pertain to a universal human law and universal human rights? We have in these commandments, we have 4 societal commandments that are against God. And then we have one commandment that is a private commandment for children and parents. Okay, it's a commandment for men, but it's more of a private thing, not a societal thing. And then we have 4 societal commandments that are human versus human crimes. But this thing about covetousness really is this is a private sin that is against God. This coveting is not a human versus human crime. Coveting is a sin against God in the heart. So what's interesting is, as I said, you had 4 against God and 6 against man. In reality, I was just saying that not to get too far ahead of myself, but in reality, you have 5 commandments that are against God and 5 commandments that are against man. 4 of them are societal, 1 of them is private. 4 of them is societal, 1 is private. That's an interesting pattern that you have there. Again, one could argue as to whether covetousness is a universal human law written on the heart of all men in all cultures and all of history at all times. But what is not debatable, okay, is that governments are not obligated to enforce thou shalt not covet. Governments can't enforce it. It's not possible. The enforcement of that law would require that governments be able to read minds and know what the hearts of men are, which is utterly impossible. And so you'll remember that in order to know what the universal human rights are, we first had to find out what the universal human laws are. And whatever the universal human laws are, they'll be recognized by all men's conscience and they'll be required by all governments to uphold. Okay? So even if we concluded that not coveting was written on the heart of all men, governments cannot police the minds of people. At least they're not supposed to. Governmental enforcement against covetousness would amount to the punishment of thought crimes. You realize that? The punishment of thought crimes. God can punish thought crimes because God knows your thoughts. And thoughts can be sinful, and God will punish sinful thoughts. So God can punish thought crimes, but not the government. Policing the mind and heart of the individual is way outside of the jurisdiction of government, and government is not allowed to police your heart and mind. And no one except God can rightly judge and administer condemnation for sins of the heart and mind, and God most certainly does not require governments to do so. All right, so since number 10 is not required for governments to uphold, okay, and it therefore cannot be related to a universal human right. And like I said, it's debatable as to whether it's even written on the heart or not. Think about it. Paul said in the book of Romans that it was that commandment, thou shalt not covet, that ended up condemning him. But here's a question to think about. Would thou shalt not covet have condemned Paul if he had been born a Gentile in South America? Do you think the commandment would have revived in that way and sin revived and he died? The commandment came, sin revived, and I died. Do you think it was covetousness that would have got him if he had been born a Gentile in South America? Paul said that he had not known lust except the law, the written scripture, had said, thou shalt not covet. But what if Paul had never read the law? Was thou shalt not covet really written on his heart? Would his heart have condemned him over inward covetousness? It's an interesting question to think about, and it's a subject for debate, but the bottom line is we have 4 absolute human laws which governments are universally required to uphold, and these 4 human laws, universal human laws, these 4, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Those 4 universal human laws applied to all men everywhere at all times are reflections of 4 universal human rights that apply to all men in all cultures at all times in history. The right to your life, the right to your wife, the right to your possessions, and the right to a fair trial. Now consider this. There are 4 universal laws, and getting close to being done, there are 4 universal laws that God said he had written on the heart of all men. Okay? Romans chapter 2. These 4 universal laws are written on the hearts of all men, and their conscience bear witness to these 4 things. Those 4 things, not all 10 things, those 4 things are written on the heart of men. Who designed and who created the human heart? Well, God did, obviously. But isn't it interesting, how many chambers does the human heart have? Well, it has 4, right? 4 chambers to the human heart. God designed it that way. Why didn't he design it with 8 chambers or 12 chambers or 15 chambers? He designed it with 4 chambers, and he said there are 4 laws that are written on the heart of all men. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not bear false witness. Is that just a coincidence? Something to think about. All right. As I mentioned earlier, going to wrap up a few things here, tie up a few loose ends here. As I mentioned earlier, the commandment against adultery seems to be the weakest link when it comes to governments upholding justice for some reason. And Satan seeks to subvert humans individually, certainly, but never forget that he's also interested in subverting humans corporately when they get together. In other words, Satan wants to subvert individuals, but he also likes to subvert governments. And when it comes to the breakdown of justice in a society, adultery, for some reason, always seems to be at the heart of things. And consider the first government on earth. Basically, angels ruling prior to the flood. Now, we know from Genesis 6 that the earth was corrupt and was full of violence, but it didn't get that way all of a sudden. So why was the earth corrupt and filled with violence? We know that from Genesis 6, before the flood. Well, we also know from Psalms 82 that prior to the flood, God had ordained angels to be the judges among men in those days, which implies that prior to the flood, angels and men existed together on the earth, just like they did apparently in the Garden of Eden, when Satan told Eve, "You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil," right? For him to be able to make that statement implied that she knew who the gods were, the angels, right? The gods, as the Bible uses that term. So it implies that angels and men were on the earth at the same time together at some point. Because the angels were the judges among men. With angels as judges, though, why was the earth corrupt and filled with violence? Couldn't an angel put a stop to that? Imagine the police force in those days being a bunch of angels, a squadron of angels. That'd be some police force. How did things get to be so bad with a situation like that? I mean, you talk about the ideal government, an angelic government, Psalms 82. Look it up, read it. We went over this a couple weeks ago. Well, let's say if you were wicked and you wanted to defund the angelic police, let's say, and you wanted to indulge in your wicked lifestyle without being harassed by the holy angels, what would you have to do? Okay? What you'd have to do is you'd have to get rid of the holy angelic judges. But you can't kill them, obviously. You can't bribe them with money. The angels have no interest in that. But you would have to corrupt them with something that they would be interested in. And you'll never guess what wicked men used to corrupt the judges in those days. Actually, you probably can guess it right off the bat, because wicked men always use this same tactic to corrupt the judges and the rulers. They used women to seduce them and corrupt them, right? It works practically every time. And we know from Genesis 6 that women are the thing that caused the angels to fall, Genesis 6, 1 through 4. But interestingly enough, in Genesis 6, God doesn't blame the angels for the destruction of the world and flood the world because of the angels, per se. He blames the earth's evil condition upon the men. He places the blame on humans, not necessarily the angels, which implies, again, that men were responsible for the angels' fall. And it wasn't the angels that were up in heaven that were just looking down on the earth, and then just all of a sudden one day they were like, wow, she's hot, and then the angels came down and, then the earth went to pot. That's kind of a naive scenario when you think about it. It doesn't make any sense. Why would that happen then and not happen now? Why was it that just one day all of a sudden the angels started lusting after women? Well, it's because, number one, the angels weren't up in heaven, they were on the ground at that time. And number two, they were seduced. Men used women to blackmail the angels, if you will, to get something that they wanted. They corrupted the judicial system with women. Now, I don't have time to get into all that, but I do explain a lot of that in my book, The Doctrine of the Doors, which you can get through Final Fight Bible Radio or Amazon Kindle, and I get into that in a lot more detail. But I just wanted to point that out. The point is, in Psalms 82, God condemned the angels for judging unjustly. But those angels didn't just wake up one day and decide to corrupt the legal system. Okay? Genesis 6 is what gives you the other piece of the puzzle and explains why their judgment became corrupt, and it had to do with women and seduction, just like it always does. And once they transgressed with a woman, corruption of justice followed, and violence and bloodshed followed, exactly as it did with David and with 1,000 other judges and rulers since then. You know, when it comes to governments and corrupting governments, using women and blackmail is like, women, that's blackmail 101. Okay? Everybody knows that's how you corrupt a government. Okay? And that's what happened in Genesis 6 in the first government. Okay? So that's something to think about. But don't spend all your time thinking about that. Okay? So finally, I want to give you something else to think about, something a little bit more positive, and I'll wrap it up for today. We have 4 negative commandments here. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not. Thou shalt not. Have you ever thought about how these commandments would read if they were restated from a positive perspective? Think about it. It's an interesting question. Think about it. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not kill thy neighbor is essentially what that is. Why do people kill their neighbors? People kill because of hate. So the positive reversal of thou shalt not kill is thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the positive reversal of it. It's the same commandment, just given from the positive perspective. Thou shalt love thy neighbor. How about this? Let's see, I want to write these things down. So the positive reversal to thou shalt not kill is thou shalt love thy neighbor. I'm going to use blue. All right, how about the second one? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, when you boil it down, people commit adultery because they don't love their spouse. You cannot love your wife and commit adultery. That's an oxymoron, obviously. Okay. All right. So the positive reversal of the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery, is thou shalt, positive, love thy wife. This is love thy neighbor. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt love thy neighbor. Thou shalt not commit adultery, negative. Thou shalt love thy wife, positive. That's the positive the same thing said in a different way. How about thou shalt not steal? Thou shalt not steal. The reason why people steal is because they are discontent with what they have. So the positive version of thou shalt not steal is thou shalt, positive, be thankful. See, God could have written it this way on the 10 Commandments. He could have. But he didn't. But it's fine. But, because the 10 Commandments, the law comes death, right? So it's going to be a negative thing anyway. But the positive version is equally true. And it's saying the same thing. Thou shalt not steal can be, the positive version of that is thou shalt be thankful. Thou shalt be thankful. How about this? Thou shalt not bear false witness. Okay? And boiled down, bearing false witness, like we've said, is lying. Bearing false witness on the commandments is lying before a court specifically. But the positive reversal of thou shalt not bear false witness is simply thou shalt be truthful. Thou shalt be truthful. I wanted to point these things out Because sometimes you can read those 10 commandments and think, oh, I'm good. I'm not stealing. I'm not committing adultery. I'm not killing anybody. I'm good. I'm not bearing false witness before a court. I'm not bringing frivolous lawsuits against people. I'm doing all right. Are you, though? Are you? Because what those commandments are saying is, thou shalt love thy neighbor. Thou shalt love thy wife. Love your spouse. Thou shalt be thankful. You may not be stealing, but are you thankful? Because that's what that commandment's all about. Thou shalt be truthful. Thou shalt be truthful. How are you doing with those things? That shines a little bit of a new light, a new perspective on the 10 commandments, doesn't it? Think about those things this week. How are you doing? Are you really keeping God's laws? The Holy Spirit will work these things in you, and they'll come naturally if you're walking in the Spirit. If you don't love your neighbor, and if you don't love your wife, and if you're not a thankful person, and if you're telling a bunch of lies and you're not truthful, I'm sorry, you are not walking in the Spirit. There is something wrong with you and your relationship with God, because these things come naturally as you yield to the new man. So anyway, hope that's a blessing to you. Thank you for tuning in, and God bless you. We'll see you next week.